I would like to welcome on stage Laurie Wayburn. She's going to tell us about how forests can help stop climate change. There you go.
This is like the ceremonial passage of the pointer. Well, thank you. That was a great trivia quiz. Good work. Since so few people really understand forests, I know that Portlanders are going to be exceptional there, and you were. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and particularly for Science on Tap. Initially, I was going to call this talk Logger for Loggers, but we decided that was a little one-dimensional, and so we called it A Path in the Woods. But ask me during the Q&A why that was going to be the title. So the Pacific Forest Trust is a think and do tank, which was founded to help protect forests for all their values, and particularly an emphasis on private forests, that's 60% of America's forests, by developing new sources of revenue for landowners to manage for what we really need. And while we really love wood, I happen to be a major lover of good wood, we really need water and a safe climate, but we had no way to pay for them. So our organization was founded on the basis that we will get people to manage for what we really want if we can pay for it. And as a result, we've focused on developing new sources of revenue for conserving for wildlife, for including forests within climate policy, and now also are working on finding new ways to finance forests for their watershed values. And we've conserved about 278,000 acres of forest land on the West Coast. And we, oh good. We own and manage forests, and we are known as that tree-hugging, tree-cutting organization. So, tonight we are here to talk about one of those really vital services of forests that is linked to, as in so often is the case, a crisis. And that is our climate crisis. And some of you are familiar with this set of curves. This is the graphic that was put together on a global basis to say how much CO2 are we putting out in the atmosphere and how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. And the blue line is actually our worst case scenario. And we're doing better than that. We are even worse than the worst case in terms of what we are looking at for atmospheric CO2. And there's only one of these lines, it's the green line, that represents a safe future for our children, grandchildren. And that green line can only be achieved through taking this walkway through the woods that we're going to do tonight. So when we think about climate change, for most people, what happens is they think, oh yeah, I should be driving a hybrid, or I should change my light bulbs. And those are both really important things to do. We need to make changes in both how we develop and use energy and how we move ourselves around. But that's only two legs of a three-legged stool. The third leg that is absolutely essential for us to have a more stable climate and better future is by working with forests. And the really good news is it's also the most immediate thing we can do. It's the cheapest thing we can do. It's the thing that puts more people to work than anything else that we can do for the dollars that we spend. And it is also going to be critical for adaptation because the climate already is changing. And what we need to do is not just lower CO2, but we need to have a more resilient world where there's enough water for us to drink, for example. So only by working in this forest sector can we do that. So just as a brief reminder, what does climate change mean for most people? It means this, or it means that. And down in California, we're likely to see this next year. Or it means this, which is what happens with these extremes of very dry and very wet years. So it's kind of biblical, you know, fires and floods. But why should you worry here? This is Portland, it's the promised land, right? Well, in the year 2080, you're going to be just like San Jose. Well, San Jose used to be full of orchards, but there's a wonderful program that's been developed to simulate what will where you live like today look like in the year 2080, and Portland's going to look like San Jose in terms of it will be hotter, particularly at night. It will be drier overall. And as a result, it's going to have really major impacts on the water supply within Oregon. And while you could look at that and say, that's the bad news, the good news is that what we do with forests will be determinative of how much water and how reliable our water supply will be as well. So it's a real twofer. So just in terms of basics, 1/3 of the Earth's land base is in forest. And yet we've already lost 1/3 of those forests. And in the process of doing that, we have contributed about 40% of the excess CO2 in the atmosphere. So forests are a solution, but they're a solution that's also part of the problem. And so in working with forests, we're not just providing an out for anybody who is in the straight emission sector of energy or transportation, but we're addressing a root cause of CO2 emissions. And it's one of those things that people say, oh, it's really complicated to talk about forests and carbon, right? Climate stuff is really, really hard. It's actually really simple when you think about it. It's the number of acres that we have in forest, how much volume of trees or how much carbon do we have in those trees, and how resilient are those? So how well do those forests take change? And the US, as I say, is one of these areas where we have huge opportunity in the US because we have a very, very productive land base, but we have been choosing, frankly, to lose a lot of that land base. And so when people think about forest loss and they're thinking about tropical forests or Brazil or in Africa, we're actually a significant part of that problem. And when I was developing these slides earlier, I realized that I had to update one of these slides, and that was the number of acres that we lose every year of forest land. And it's gone in 10 years from 1.25 million to 1.5 million acres lost every year to conversion. Actually, a big force of that conversion is to roadways. It's interesting. So the US has something in this to gain as well by changing this paradigm. These are just some images from Atlanta. This is the poster child of sprawl growth, not LA, Atlanta. The Puget Sound lost 13% of its forest land in 16 years. And it's not that we don't need land for development, we do. It's just a question of where and what choices we're making within that. So how do forests create emissions? Roughly 1/3 of the carbon that is stored in a forest, and the carbon is just in the wood, is almost immediately released on harvest. And that's because, oh, we have a cricket in the audience. So when you think of a tree being felled, and there are the branches and the needles and the fine roots, all that doesn't go off to the mill decays within 5 years that's on the top of the surface. And roughly 1/3 goes into wood products, and roughly 1/3 stays in the stump and the roots and slowly decays over time. So that's just what happens. If you think about forests and the carbon within them as money in the bank, it's like you had your bank account and you take 2/3 of the money out and you leave 1/3 of the money in. So there's still carbon in the forest when it leaves, and there's carbon in the wood products. Carbon in the forest will slowly decay, carbon in wood products will as well. And when you think about this from the upside, if you will, forests are the only emissions sector that can reabsorb its own emissions. But it takes time. You know, this building was built roughly 100 years ago, and the wood that's in this building is old growth. It was probably 200 to 300 years old. So you are within 400 years of embodied carbon right here. But usually we don't wait that long to reabsorb those emissions. And the point of this graph is to say that after 100 years, you still have almost 40% of your emissions out in the atmosphere. So while reforesting is really important, it takes time to reabsorb that. And here in Oregon, where forestry or timber harvest is an important part of the economy, the emissions from harvest aren't actually counted in your emissions inventory. If they were, as a single source of emissions, they would be the single largest source of emissions in the state. As it is, when you combine all the other two sectors are larger. But as a single sector, harvest removal alone is the single largest source. Now, I may need a little bit of technical, I'm going to make sure I know how to do this. Oh, sorry, there's a video here, and I'm not sure how to run this off of a, can I get a little technical assistance here? Help, help. So this slide is a video. There you go, thank you. So this is a really interesting visualization of the removal of tree cover in Oregon over a 17-year period. And while some of this is forest fires, you can see the biscuit fire down in the lower left-hand corner there. The vast majority of this is timber harvest. So it's at this point that you go, we're doing this to our forests, it's been pretty rough. But the great news about forests is as I say, you can restore them. And in doing this, we want to be sure that what we're doing is making a real difference. So this is a diagram that shows the different ways that forests work in that carbon dynamic. And she figured after that video I needed a beer. Okay. Well, we'll have to stop for a minute. So, you know, some things in life are really essential. You just can't do without them. And I think beer falls in that category. And one of the other things that is true about beer is it effervesces, so it lets off CO2. So the reason that I think of lager for loggers is that as a way to close the loop in your beer drinking habits, work with forests. So within forests, it works for sparkling wine too. So within forests, there's only one way to draw in CO2, and that is through growing the forest. Everything else that happens is a transfer of carbon out of the forest. Goes to milling and manufacturing, it'll go into waste. Both of those become emissions over time. And you'll notice the arrow that goes over towards the fossil fuel with biomass. If you can substitute for fossil fuels with wood energy, or when we find the right microbe and we're able to create ethanol for cars out of wood chips, then that would also be a very significant way to reduce net emissions. So I mentioned earlier that these are the largest, safest, and most expandable carbon sink. So unlike the ocean, we are happy to put carbon into forests. And they're also the most immediate way that we can make a difference. And there are three things that we can do. We can reduce forest loss. These are the 3 R's for those of you old enough to remember the 3 R's. We can reduce forest loss. We can restore forests to their more natural carbon carrying capacity. Forests in the US are at about 10 to 50% at most of their natural carbon capacity. And we can reforest where we have lost forest. So that's a real portfolio of approaches that we can do. And within that, there are both tools that we can use, and many of you have heard about carbon offsets. I'm not going to actually talk about carbon offsets. I'm going to hope that you're going to ask me questions about them, because they're a tool, but they are not the whole picture by far. I want to focus in on the whole sector, with forests. And the reason for this is we would not imagine changing the energy sector simply by giving a tax credit for changing your light bulbs. It's an important tool. We should change our light bulbs. But we want to transform the sector. And so with the forest sector, for it to contribute like that 37 to 40% of the solution, we have to work across the whole sector. So as I mentioned, preventing conversion or reducing it. The second one, conserve it and managing for older forests, I'm going to spend some time on restoring forests and replacing fossil fuels. So most people, when they think about forests and they think about climate, they say, tree planting, let's plant trees. And we should. We should. But when you plant a tree, it's not going to be even as big as this in all likelihood. And as big as this is the amount of carbon that it's going to have. With an old tree, that's the carbon that you have. And so we want to maintain and grow for those old trees even as we are planting new trees within that. And many people think about, okay, well, young trees grow faster, just like with human beings. Young people grow faster, and you slow down in your growth when you get older. But within that, those older forests have more mass, and so even if the rate of growth is less, it's rate on a stock. So think about as having new bank accounts that earn you 6%, and you open it with $100 and you get 6%, that's cool. Or you have $10,000 and it's earning 4%, or you have $100,000 and it's earning 2%. In terms of the annual amount of money that you're earning the most on the biggest, oldest account. So you want accounts of all sorts, you want a portfolio. This is a demonstration about carbon uptake over time. And it shows that the more time you have there, you're going to keep absorbing more carbon, so it's a stock basis. This is a more familiar curve, but again, the older the forest, the more carbon that's within it, and just like that bank account where you don't want to liquidate it and only have a third of it left, you want to maintain those older forests. And this is a map of forests across the country, and the take-home out of this that's important is that the vast majority of our forests are young, and this is a huge opportunity. So we're kind of at that optimal curve for many of these to move them from not just having a high growth rate on a small stock, but a lower growth rate on a really big stock. And you'll see that Oregon actually has some of the older ones. But this is a really critical thing, that we have flipped the composition of our forests in terms of old versus young. 200 years ago, the vast majority of our forests were older than 200 years. Today, the vast majority is actually under 75. And so this is the challenge. The time value of money, people think in quarterly returns, maybe annual returns. They don't think about century returns. And from the climate perspective, we need to do that. And that's where we want to go. And we've just talked about this, so I'm not going to reiterate this, but it's a really, really critical point because it's what you hear all the time. Young forests grow fast, let's plant trees. That's a really good thing to do, but it's not a sufficient thing to do. And this is a peculiarly Oregonian, and so it's a peculiarly Oregonian, Washingtonian, and then southeast of the United Statesian challenge, where there is more of the economy within this state that is derived from the timber industry than the national. And that's an important thing to recognize when you think about where we need to go. And that is that we actually have a really elegant symmetry between taking the workforce that is involved within forest management and deploying it more broadly to restore those older, more natural forests, to do the kind of work that is needed to be done in terms of having more resilient forests. And because of the fact that the single most effective dollar spent in job creation is one spent in forest conservation, so there's a tremendous value there in terms of economic sustainability as well. One thing I want to mention out of this is that inherent in what I'm talking about is that you can't just think of one phase of a forest. You need to think about the whole cycle of that forest, from being within the forest to being in the products, going into emission, being reabsorbed, and think about that over time. That's a real challenge for human beings. But we think of long-term as 100 years, and yet if you think about what we're looking at with climate, that's a very short period of time. So, this is just a slide about the various kinds of ways that we can approach this set of issues. Because land is regulated at the state level and not at the federal level, there's only a certain amount that the federal government can do, and a lot of land use is regulated at the county level. Regulations can also be changed over time. So they're an important tool, but they're a temporary tool quite often. Incentive payments are really important, but they're also often very short-term and can be reversed. Things like conservation easements that are perpetual, at least in the human time frame within this country, that's a longer, good time frame to be thinking about. And then carbon credits within that offset market generally have a 100-year time frame, so they're a good step on the way within that. I think one of the things that we want to have in mind in thinking about working with forests is where we are today is okay, but not great. And in fact, we're draining our forest carbon sinks, so we need to do something more. And it needs to be measurable, not down to the fine level, but in the right direction that we need to go. And we need to recognize that additionality, and we need to have it be resilient. Everybody still with me? Right there, along with our friend the elk. So one of the things I was mentioning is about how when we work for carbon richness, we're also going to be helping ourselves in terms of adaptation. And that is because older forests that store more carbon also capture and store more water. And one of the critical things to think about there is, how many of you go out hiking? Fair number, fair number. So if you're out hiking on a misty day, you know how the water droplets condense on your face as you're moving through. And part of that is created by turbulence. So in our coastal forests, up to 25% of the precipitation in those coastal forests comes from fog drip. And that is because as the wet air moves through and it hits tall trees, it does the turbulence and it gets recaptured and recirculated again. Whereas if it's an even straight ahead canopy, it just blows straight across and is only captured once. So it's a really critical thing to have that more natural structure with older trees and variability that our older forests have. The other thing is that whether it's like, again, if you've walked through an area that's recently been burned, old dead logs are the refugia for all the little critters that are there because they're wet. And while there are not a lot of them per acre, they add up into incremental gains in terms of water. And older forests have gaps in the trees. And so when you have snow, more snow will come down and filter into those forests and sit on the ground, and it's the last snow to melt. Any of you who've walked in the woods in the winter at the tailing into spring, that's where you find the snow. Those are important things in terms of that hotter, drier world that we are entering into even here in Oregon, because that water is in shorter supply. Now, these are pictures actually taken from a forest that we manage in Northern California. I have one in Oregon shortly, but we were doing a tour this late summer, and I thought it was really great how one of the young people went up and said, "Can I lift your saw?" And she actually wasn't quite strong enough, because I'm not strong enough to lift that saw. But this is on a forest that we have managed in less than 20 years to go from about 20,000 board foot to the acre to about 70,000 board foot to the acre, and we remove about 1 million board foot a year. And so the reason that I bring that up is that often when people are talking about forests and climate, they're going to pit the timber industry against those climate environmentalists. But actually, this is part of the synergy, because we need people who know how to manage forests, who can drive big equipment and handle those big saws in order to restore the kind of forest that we want and that we need within this climate-changing world. So this is a picture taken on a forest that we manage, about 7,200 acres just outside of Corvallis. And when we took over the management of the forest, 85% of it was 20 years and younger. And it was single species, and it was Doug fir. And so it had been planted for pulp. And yet, that is not a very climate resilient nor economically resilient forest because pulp markets are pretty variable. So in taking this over, we wanted to show how we could overlap management to restore net carbon stores to these forests and, to that 200 to 300,000 board foot to the acre on forests that had under 10,000 board foot to the acre. And so we have been managing that forest for almost 20 years now. And we have removed, I'll try to do these from memory, so I'll apologize, but we have removed enough board footage to frame out almost 1,500 houses, and we have 2,000 square feet, and almost 5 million reams of paper in the chip side of it. And we've more than doubled the carbon stores. So that's that overlap of forestry and restoring older forests, having a supply of products come out, having people be employed, and yes, it does mean cutting trees. This is a beautiful spruce that we took down as part of that. And within other forest types, this is a forest down in the southeast, which is much drier forest type than the one that I was just talking about. And in managing this forest, which has a variety of habitats on it, this is being managed for a way that it will be much more resilient to fire and will also have habitats for as many species as it currently has and more, which is over 200. And so these are some of the ways that we can approach how we manage forests to get to that significant portion of the solution that we need in the US. So we currently count our forests as achieving about 12% of emissions reductions in the US. If we go forward and say, what can we do over the next 50 years to move that curve from the blue line to the green line, this is going to be a key way that we do that. By reducing forest loss from that 1.5 million acres to less than half of that, by changing the age composition of our forests to maximize our older forests, and by reforesting in many areas that it really makes sense to do. If you think about it, reforestation on all of our riparian sections across the country, and if you can imagine reforesting along the Mississippi from the top to the bottom, what that would do, in addition to providing fabulous intern opportunities over the summer for college students, all the way down through grade school. But if you think about it from the carbon absorption, from the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the sediment, and the cooling of the water, these are extraordinary benefits that forests will bring over that. And there's no other sector that can do this by 2050. And for those of you who were thinking about a year ago when they came out and said we have 10 to 12 years, that means we now have 11 years, to change the direction of that curve, and you think about the age structure that we have in our forests, it's a really smart strategy to kind of get at the inflection point of forests and move them from an average age of 30 years to 40 years to 50 years, just like we've been doing on the forests that we manage. We're getting out a lot of product, but we're still doubling the carbon and more. And the really positive news about this is it's not just far away in the woods that we can do this. For all of you who are alliterative in the audience, it's from the urban core to the forest floor and the ocean shore that we can make these kinds of changes in how we manage in the land sector. Because there are opportunities at all of them, and forests certainly are the biggest opportunity by far. And managing for older forests is the biggest opportunity in the forest sector. But One of the really critical things is that we need to involve people from all walks of life in this. And you can think about that in the urban context in terms of reestablishing urban forests or establishing them where they don't have them, and growing organic foods, which stores significantly more carbon than non-organic, in terms of establishing these stream corridors and bringing back native plants and grasses. Native grasses are way undervalued in my view. And one way to do this, earlier this year, we had a rather disappointing failure of an effort to pass a climate policy in Oregon, and one of the key reasons it was cited for that was that there were some folks in the timber industry who said, we're against this. This is going to really raise the cost of doing business. So California and Oregon are often rivals for the most timber produced in any given year. And so while California has a ton more people, and from a per capita contribution, forestry is even smaller than here, within California's climate policy, about $4 billion have been allocated to go into the natural and working land sector, and a lot of that is into forests. And amongst the things that pays for is not just these things out in the woods, but it pays for cleaner engines, for logging equipment. It pays for better equipment within mills to reduce emissions. And when we think about all of these issues in climate policy, we want to spend our dollars so that we get good outcomes. This is one where we know that we can do that and we can generate that. I think that's also really critical in terms of the opportunities to bridge the gap between many of our people in urban areas and rural areas, is getting more people involved in working with nature to solve that climate crisis. We will also be able to bridge some of our political differences. And with that, I'd love to take questions.
Thank you, Laurie. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I will come around to you. I see a couple over there. First question, I know you were just talking about what people can do in urban environments. So I just planned with Friends of Trees, which I don't know if you know that organization here, to plant some trees in my yard. Does that really make a difference, or is it just nice for my yard?
It does make a difference. And one way to think about it is, how many of you have ever complained about an ATM charge? A few people. So it's a really small charge, but if you get lots of charges, it makes a lot of money, which is why banks do it. So any individual tree in and of itself might not absorb that much carbon, but within an entire urban landscape, it makes a significant difference. The other difference that it makes, of course, is in your energy bills, heating and cooling. So trees really reduce your heating and cooling bills. And as Portland becomes San Jose, you're going to have to worry about your cooling bills.
Thank you. So this spring, early summer, I watched a documentary series called Canopy Stories, and it was short films based on the trees in Portland. And you mentioned a lot about old growth, and Portland actually has a ton of old growth trees. So is it just as important for Portland to maintain those trees as it is to maintain our forests?
Absolutely, yeah. And for a variety of reasons, not just for their carbon value, but because it's been shown that single old trees become refugia for many species that then repopulate out. And since Amanda likes bats, I get to share my bat delight. Old trees have thick bark, and bats nest in that and roost in that thick bark.
I'm originally from the Puget Sound, and there are a lot of evergreen trees there. Moving here 10 years ago, there are lots of deciduous trees in Portland. Does that play into anything, the difference between deciduous and evergreen trees?
So if I understand the question, does it matter if it's a deciduous or if it's a coniferous tree? And all trees are important.
You had mentioned about giving an opportunity to a landowner to possibly profit off the gain of water. Can you go into that a little bit?
So, yeah, about 65% of all of our drinking water originates in forests. And yet, water is the original free lunch, to mix our metaphors, for forest landowners. So our approach to this has been to work with forest watersheds the same way we work with the rest of water infrastructure. We all know we have to pay something for a dam. We all know we have to pay something to get the water delivered to us through a pipe. And so we've been working and got a law passed in California. Now there's been one passed in Montana, and we're now working at the federal level to qualify watersheds as part of water system infrastructure so that you can finance their repair and maintenance the same way. Another challenge has been that under the General Accounting Standards Board, or GASB, if this is too much in the initials, but a water agency could not count improvements in its watershed on its books. Equally, it couldn't count the degradation of that watershed on its books. So it didn't matter. So there's been a change now that we were part of, but we didn't lead it, to have water agencies now have, under GASB, the ability to count improvements in their watersheds on their books. And that's important because it means they can justify it to ratepayers that there's an increase in the charge with that. So we've been working on that legal side to make it something that, while water agencies may well recognize that there are risks if they don't have their watershed in good condition, they couldn't justify it to their ratepayers to say, I want you to pay me money. And they'd say, well, for what? It's not an asset. So now it's an asset, and legally it's defined as part of the water system, so that system for payments is getting put into place. And then the next step for us is, depending upon where we are, to work with individual water entities to help that payment system get funneled back to landowners. The payment system that we're working on is not a commodity-based system. So that's one of the real challenges for people who think about water, is that water is more of a right than a commodity, and you can't guarantee how much is going to be produced. So this is a payment for improvement in watershed condition.
Over here.
Hello, I have a question. We recently purchased like 19 acres that used to be a Christmas tree farm that was never harvested. The forest plan that we did told us that we need to cut down about half the trees to thin them. What do I do with the trees? From what you were saying, you cut them down, release all the carbon. That doesn't sound very appealing to me. What type of suggestion? I mean, they're like 6 inches in diameter. They're tiny little things that are super tall, and a bunch of them are dying. It's like, okay, I can tell I need to do something, but what can I do to not make the impact worse when I thin the trees?
Well, it's not necessarily a bad thing to have the trees decompose and go into the soil, because that does reestablish soil carbon, which is an important thing to reestablish. By the same token, there are not a lot of reliable markets for a relatively small landowner for small dimensional stuff. And so there's not a lot of ways that you can sell that unless you had a chipper and you wanted to give away chip to your neighbors for their landscaping purposes. But that would not make things worse, chipping and spreading. No, actually that's what I do on my own small woodlot. I do that, and I also do a slow burn for charcoal to go back into the soil. So a little kind of mini biochar approach there. But not a commercial opportunity.
No,
No. Yeah.
After that, it's just like, I don't want to make things worse.
Well, you wouldn't be. One of the other interesting things is that when you thin, say, 30% of your stems, within 20 years, you'll have reabsorbed that amount of carbon, but you'll packed it back on to trees that are much stronger. So you'll be doing a good thing.
Thank you, Laurie, for being here. I really appreciate it. So some of the California fires have been caused by PGE not maintaining their electric lines. Does your organization, Pacific Forest Trust, do political advocacy in that area to make sure that electric companies are maintaining their lines well?
You know, most of those lands are not lands that they have. They're not their lands. Those transmission lines are traveling through other people's private lands and through a lot of our public lands as well. What we are advocating for is actually that electric companies and hydropower companies pay into an insurance fund that the state would then use to take those monies and invest in doing restoration across the landscape. And the reason that I think that makes sense is, this was a trivia question that I was almost going to put out there, but I decided not to. All right, how much money did insurance companies alone, not the government, insurance companies alone, pay out last year for fire damages? Okay, 5 billion? 10 billion? 20 billion? 25 billion. Yeah, that was last year alone, $25 billion. That's in 1 year. And so if you go back to the prior fire year, so in other words, you get the idea, it's a lot of money. So when you think about other climate change costs, like the floods out of the Oroville Dam, so restoring the forested watersheds above the Oroville could have reduced flood intensity by anywhere from 25 to 40%. Doesn't mean the Oroville Dam wouldn't have broken because of its condition, but it means that there would have been a lot more time to release water, 3 or 4 weeks to release water to prevent the dam from breaking. So hydropower as well as energy both. These are the kinds of things that paying into an insurance fund, because the costs of climate change are staggering. And if we can pay upfront to reduce that through working with land, everybody benefits.
There one over here.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was really informative. I appreciate it. I originally was going to start asking the question about old growth and why is old growth different and more important than young growth, but I think you did a good job answering that. But the answer is very complicated, and it's not, you know, it took the time to be here and listen. So what's the best way to communicate that benefit of old growth versus new growth? And related, is young growth tree is beneficial to the industry as old growth?
You know, the industry has moved from being really a timber-focused industry to a fiber-focused industry. And that is for 2 reasons. One is there isn't the same quality of timber as there was on the first and second passes. And 2 is the pressure of the investment community on the forest industry to deliver higher returns. So you have a combination of things that you don't have the quality of timber that would have the structural characteristics that people are looking for. And so you don't have that market pull for that. You can't manage for that. And you have to have a quicker turn on your money. So most forest land has become what's called a financial asset. So in the past, up until like the 1985 or so, forests were owned as what's called an industrial asset or a personal asset, and that was a long-term asset. Now it's owned as a financial asset, which is a very short-term time horizon on that. So the combination of wanting to have higher returns and quicker returns on your money, and the fact that you don't have the old stuff that meets the quality requirements, means that they've moved to fiber. And I think the way to communicate is not to say that anything is better than anything else, but simply older forests store more carbon. It's really looking at for carbon richness, climate resilience, and young forests just don't have that. So we were all brought up on two things, Smokey the Bear and tree planting. We planted way too many trees to the acre. We planted trees the way people used to have children, which is, you knew a bunch of them were going to die, so you had a lot. I'm serious. It was an insurance policy. So we were planting like 2,000 trees to the acre. These aren't acres that could support maybe 100 or 200. So we planted too many, and then we suppressed all the fire. So we created, shall we say, a perfect storm that we are now seeing played out in the kinds of forest fires that we have. So does that help?
Yeah, I mean, it explains the situation.
Older forests store more carbon.
I think it's just a complicated message why old forests are better.
Well, maybe the other way to think about it is don't spend all your inheritance at once. So if you think about it, older forests are like the big gift from the past. We've inherited it from other generations. And you don't want to blow it all at once. In fact, you want to leave an even bigger inheritance for your kids. It's good. She's going to give me time for another sip of beer.
Okay, hey, it's working now.
Could you please expound on the native grasses and why they're so underrated and how we help them to reestablish over the non-native grasses?
Yes. So native grasses have a rootstock like this. That means they're sucking carbon down 3 feet. European grasses, most of our grasses that we see out there are European. You got a root mass like that. So they store a lot less carbon. They're a lot more prone to burning. And one of the awful things that they do, through no fault of their own, that's just the way they are, is they have a really, really, really thick root mat. So the Willamette Valley has fabulous oaks, but the oak roots can't get past that root mat of non-native grasses. And the Willamette Valley was burned historically a lot by Native American tribes because it created the condition for game and also for oaks, which was an important food source for them. So reestablishing native grasses will also help reestablish that very vulnerable oak woodland community, which is it's a really important part of Oregon.
Hi. Ultimately, my question is, who do we look to for leadership in this area? Because I think of, national forests, state forests, BLM land, but you, through your talk, said that the federal government doesn't really have regulation over this. So who do we look to lead the charge to reforest or keep conservation?
Well, you can certainly look to the federal government on the federal lands. And actually, one of the concepts that we're promoting is the idea of having strategic climate reserves in our federal lands. So that's something where managing them as kind of an insurance pool to help achieve our goals for climate and a climate-safe future is something that is federal. But anybody here ever read Pogo? Pogo was old when I was little, but who do we look to? You look to yourself. And what I mean by that is, time for another sip of beer. I think that'll do it. It is through our own engagement in helping people understand what they can do to encourage for example, urban forests, to conserve around urban centers so that we keep our natural and working lands rather than having them be all fragmented and developing up. So supporting programs like Oregon's Agricultural Heritage Program, Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board programs that call for conservation and that the state itself helps fund. These are things that you can do by sharing with your neighbor, gee, did you realize how important forests were in climate? Because 99% of people, when you ask them what's a climate solution, they say, drive a hybrid car. And so if you, in your own life, talk with your friends, neighbors, acquaintances, and help them understand what forests do, you make a big difference.
I'm going to jump in here. Do you want to talk about the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts?
I do, thank you.
You're welcome.
So Oregon has a fabulous organization called the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts. We're a board member for them. And they are a group of these private, voluntary, nonprofit organizations that work with private landowners to help them conserve their land in perpetuity. And there's only one other kind of entity that ever promises to do something in perpetuity, and it is cemetery societies. Yeah, they promise that they will keep your ashes safe for perpetuity. But the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts is a terrific organization that promotes private voluntary land conservation through working with private landowners to help them conserve their lands. And they're a big part of the climate solution from my perspective because, okay, last trivia question possibly. What subject has a higher bipartisan vote than any other nationally? Private voluntary land conservation. It gets more Republican and Democratic support than any other issue, not healthcare, not defense, certainly not climate. But everybody agrees it's important to conserve and steward land. And so groups like the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts are a way to, again, pull people together for a shared, better future.
Another question back here.
So I'm curious, this is just your opinion, but with everything right now in a general sense, I know you're saying switching the light bulbs, like that's great, but this and that, with the general attention right now brought to just climate change, you know, with the younger demographic and just kind of everybody being aware, in your personal opinion, are you optimistic, even though the charts you showed, you know, at the beginning were heading not in the best way, but with the younger demographic, do you feel confident or good, if you will, about the opinion and where we're heading?
Yes. Well, you know why? Is human beings adapted to the threat of the saber-toothed tiger, right? It's going to jump on you, you run. And I've been working on climate change issues for a rather long time. And it's kind of like it's getting closer. It's getting closer. It's getting closer. Oh my God, it's here. And it is here. And I think that we do respond and we pull together around crisis. We're not very good at foresightful action to prevent crisis. So the fact that it's gotten pretty bad means it's going to get better.
Sorry. Oh. Okay. Another question over here.
I'm kind of fascinated by the concept that you can make an accounting change and suddenly something like watershed restoration becomes an asset and is actually valued. What other things can we do? Like, what value do you place on breathable air without an asthma attack? What value do you place on drinkable water without... What other changes can we make in sort of that accounting bureaucracy so that we can establish values on it and demerits for companies that damage things?
Well, we actually did do exactly that in creating the carbon offset, because we literally created an asset out of thin air, which is by trees absorbing carbon, we gave them value just for being. And in terms of negative value, shall we say avoided cost, that doesn't actually drive action because you didn't have to pay it and nobody received a check. So I'll take this question from the point of view of what changes in law do we need to make in order to write checks to people for doing what we want them to do. And unfortunately, that means being willing to, number one, tax ourselves on some levels, because we pay for things. So if we say we want to have a way to pay landowners to do something different, we have to be willing to pay. And the only way that we currently do that is by levying a fine. So if you pollute the water, you pay a fine. If we pass laws that said the water comes out of your property when it's colder, we pay you a certain amount of money, or we give you a tax credit for that. So we currently pay only for when we're caught doing the bad thing, and we don't pay for when we're doing the good thing. So it would be an interesting thing to have that conversation from the point of view of paying directly to landowners when they met, for example, water quality targets for the water leaving their land. I don't have an immediate answer for you of the next best thing with that, except relative to tax credits, which is that if we created tax credits for increasing the age on forests, or we forewent the severance tax on harvests when we had older forests or they met certain targets, those would be ways to pay private landowners immediately for that. So I'm talking about in the private market sense as opposed to our public lands. But that would be one that would do it.
I had two quick questions. First, what's that animal?
That is a Pacific fisher. And they don't eat fish, but they're really cute.
Yeah. Okay, and then second, earlier in your slide deck, you had a map of North America that showed the relative age of forests.
Yeah.
And I noticed that, like, way up in Canada, there was this arc of really young forest, you know, kind of at the same latitude as, like, all the old forest up in Alaska. Is that attributable to logging? Like, why is there all that really young forest up there? Like, it was far north.
I'd have to pull the slide up to be able to tell you what I know about it, but it could well be the forests in Alberta, which have been, there are more trees harvested in Alberta for thumping lines, for oil shale exploration than there are in timber harvest. And in the past quarter century, they have literally leveled sections of Alberta for that. So I don't know if that is it or not.
Okay, we'll do one or two more questions.
So we seem to be going through a big phase of the benefits of hemp for wood fiber and so forth. I was wondering what effect that had on the environment.
Was it the benefits of hemp?
Hemp growth. Faster growth, quicker to replace wood fiber, things like that.
So if I'm understanding the question, is it like, should we encourage things like hemp and bamboo that have quick growing cycles for fiber production? If you want quick fiber production, it's hard to beat the loblolly pine. But you know, what I would argue for is that there's a tremendous amount of fiber that we are unable to access in any commercially valuable way as part of forest restoration because we can't pay enough for it. And because we're only focused on the fiber portion of it. And I think if you're trying to look for an agricultural model, I think, you know, growing hemp, growing bamboo, growing young loblolly are about the same. Yes. I mean, I don't have any problem with people cutting trees. I use paper. I like paper. I like wood. I have what some people call wood envy. I have recycled wood in my house, actually from a mill in Longview that was taken down. Beautiful wood. So I don't think we need to have a substitute for pulp and paper, but I think we have to be smart about how we do it.
I have a simplistic question, I think, that maybe there's no simplistic answer for, but I was visiting one of our Oregon state forests, and I saw a section of land that all the trees had been cleared or cut down. I think you would call that clear cutting. I hope I'm using that term correctly. And I was sad because I went there to see the forests, and there's a big chunk of land where a bunch of trees are cut down, and that's too bad. Then later I read a plaque that said that clear cutting forests is good because what happens is if you only thin the trees, then you reduce the amount of sunlight that hits the ground, and that's not a good environment for new trees. Fresh, new little trees like to have lots of sunlight, and thinning the forest is not as good as just cutting all the trees down. And I thought, oh, well, I didn't even think of that. Maybe that's true. But that seems like a little bit of a self-serving thing from the point of view of the people who are cutting the trees, but I don't know. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, if that were the case, we would have never had any forests in the first place. How did we get the forests that we had that, they somehow managed to grow without having clear cutting? I don't know. Oh. I mean, the thing is that it's really interesting when you think about the evolution of forestry from the point of view of forests, not from the point of view of producing timber or producing fiber. And I think we often make the mistake of thinking that managing for timber or fiber is managing for a forest. Because a forest has many, many functions in it, whether it's watershed, whether it's habitat, whether it's nutrient cycling. And that's where that whole practice of natural forest management is so critical. And there's been a real evolution, a tremendous evolution, which is kind of like going back to basics in forestry to recognize that natural forest management, i.e. working with how that forest grew and how it grows and its dynamics, is going to produce more sustainable results than simply managing for any single aspect like the fiber or the timber. And so in the 1960s, there were people who maintained with an absolutely straight face that you could not get regeneration on anything other than a clear cut. And if that were a case, when a tree fell in the forest, you'd never have a tree replace it, right? And that's obviously not the case, because you have the whole phenomenon that was discovered here in Oregon of, for example, the hemlock nurse logs. An old hemlock would fall, an old Doug fir would fall down, and hemlock would fall down, and new trees would grow up all along it. And people were going, wow, look at that little line of trees. Well, it's because they all grew on the dead tree. So there's been a real change in forestry. And for anybody who's really into learning about this stuff, Jerry Franklin put out a book 2 years ago, which is really the compendium of knowledge about natural forest management. But in direct answer for your question, you can absolutely get regeneration in very small openings. But thinning, because we have tended to plant far too many trees to the acre, thinning is an essential tool. And it's one that you can kind of, that's the great thing about thinning and maintaining a forest or moving back to a natural forest, is we had much more carbon to the acre, just the board footage to the acre in our older forests. And fewer trees to the acre, so more carbon but packed onto fewer trees. So all the little trees are okay, they're good, they're the next generation, but better we should manage them in a natural forest management context.
With that, let's say thank you to Laurie Wayburn. Thank you, Laurie, that was great.
Thank you.